This video is part of the first phase of the approach to uh, collaborative local development. It is, it is aimed at development leaders, but also others who would have an interest in understanding the particular approach that I base on the work of British sociologist Margaret Archer and have adapted in the work that I've been doing in South Africa over the last number of years. The point of departure is that the problem that we encounter in countries like South Africa um, is acute inequality, um, economic inequality, exclusion, marginalization, deprivation. Many people, millions of people in a country like South Africa that are excluded from the opportunities of participating in the mainstream of society and thereby excluded from the possibility of achieving a decent quality of life or experience relatively good well-being. I start this approach with reference to the idea that we should think about society as a system and that we should try and get into our minds the idea of a more equal system as contrasted to the very unequal system that we have in place at the moment. An equal system or a just system is one in which the majority of people experience a reasonable quality of life um, and have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. And an unequal system is one in which a small number of people have that opportunity and the majority are excluded from that. And I want to go further in suggesting that exclusion and um, and deprivation and the non-fulfillment of an individual's potential should be seen as a personal tragedy, um, and a tragedy in a number of other ways, but it is also a tragedy from a systemic point of view. And that is because I make the argument that the potential of the society or a community as a system is equivalent to the sum total of the potential of its subunits or the people that live in that particular societal system. And if one of the people in the social system does not achieve its potential, it potentially has negative effects for everyone, not just for that individual, because it means that the potential of the system is reduced by the absence of that one particular individual's contribution that has not been made. So it makes the system weaker. Therefore, it is important, it is a systemic imperative that as many as possible people in a society or in a community or a social system achieve their potential. So graphically, I'm going to just show what I mean in a moment. And Much of what I do in order to make this approach um, understandable to as many as possible people, particularly taking into account that one wants to talk to people at a community level, and that you want to facilitate what I refer to as a mindset shift from adversarial politics, and particularly protest politics, towards collaborative development. If you take that into account, what one wants to achieve is to get as many as possible influential people, decision makers at a community level to understand this approach and to adopt the appropriate mindset, and then to start working with that in mind in terms of bringing about the necessary transformation that we want to see in society. So the first graphic, simple. All my graphics very simple, easy to understand. The first one, idea of society as a system. So that's a society, theoretically. Um, an unequal society looks like this. A small number of people achieving their potential, and many more not achieving their potential. That's the inequality. Small number of people included, large number of people excluded. And the more this becomes systemically entrenched, the more it's got consequences for the small number of people that are actually achieving their potential. Because as I will suggest in a moment, they are inevitably, whether they like it or not, they are dependent on one another. So obviously, an equal system theoretically, and obviously theoretical because you will never get a situation where everyone in a society achieves their potential. But in theory, this is um, this is then what an equal system would look like, where all those negatives have been turned into positives. And the critical point that we need to make here, this is the key important insight that enables people to move from a mindset of adversarial politics and protest politics to collaboration, is to understand that in a systemic context, these two sections of this community or society are dependent on one another whether they like it or not. And to illustrate that, I refer to what happens in the communities that I work in, where you have farmers who have done well in terms of running their farms and becoming relatively affluent, and them and their families are achieving their potential as individuals and as members of society. However, the majority of people that work on these farms and live in the communities surrounding these farms have not actually significantly benefited from the success that was experienced by these farmers. So here you have a situation of inequality. It creates a situation of underlying strain and conflict, and you have the potential of, as the majority of people that are being excluded in this system becomes more and more disgruntled and dissatisfied with their life, the more and more they are likely to become not only unproductive in terms of being farm workers, but also becoming angry and making use of the means of protest politics in order to boycott, strike, and to eventually threaten the very nature of of an essence of this local economy. So one of the things that the farmers need to understand, they really need to understand this well, and that is that for them to keep on having a decent quality of life, and for them and their families to fulfill their potential on an ongoing and sustainable basis, they need to concern themselves with the interests and the quality of life of the people that work on their farms and live in these adjacent communities. If they're not going to do that, their long-term sustainable quality of life is certainly going to be threatened. And this is what we've seen in many communities in South Africa, where the farm workers and the local communities simply decided that they've had enough, and they started rebelling and responding to this very acute inequality. So it is in the interest of the farmers to understand the bigger picture and understand that they are dependent also on these workers and these local communities. Of course, the other way around also apply, in the sense that these farmers, these farm workers and local communities need to understand that these farmers and their farms need to be successful, because it provides them with employment opportunities. It provides them with a means to make it possible for them and their families to have an income, and at least a minimal quality of life. That is the problem, that it is so limited. And so the challenge, the developmental challenge in a community like this, is to see the problem of limited self-fulfillment, the limited achievement of potential of the majority of people, as not only the problem of the people that are victims of the situation, but as a common problem that are experienced and affected by everyone. And thus, it requires collaboration, it requires working together between these two major sectors of people in this community or society to address that issue. And in the same way that the ongoing productivity of the farmers and the farms also requires a collaborative approach, one that is based on the logic of interdependence, in order to achieve that goal of the success of that local economy, so that those who are dependent on that economy can also go on having a decent living, a decent life, and ideally, if the developmental process succeeds, it become increasingly better off in terms of their quality of life. That is the first message that we need to convey to everyone in the system. You need one another. You can't go without one another. There is no option here. If you're part of the system, you're part of the system. And if you break down any part of the system or diminish its qualities, you will suffer the consequences. So, when I talk about development, I use the term in order to explain the process of moving from this unequal systemic situation towards a more just and equal systemic arrangement. Okay? And as I indicated earlier, I attempt to use a set of basic graphics in order to explain what I mean with development and its different aspects and dimensions. So, what do I mean with development? First thing is I draw this very simple graph. Very simple graphic with a vertical and a horizontal axis, and the horizontal axis refers to time. The vertical axis refers to quality of life, and it goes from low quality of life to high quality of life. And the development process is a process that goes from an undesirable status quo towards a desirable future. And it is an undulating up and down, stop and start process. That's the first critical image beyond the basic idea of the system. But understanding what development means, this is the paradigm. This is the idea that I want people to have in their minds. And I have drawn this picture with a stick in my hand in the sand for communities in deep rural Eastern Cape communities to understand, illiterate communities that actually immediately understand what we are talking about. So this is not about being academically smart or impressive. This is about getting to understand the concept of development. And looking at this, there are a number of critical issues that we need to observe. Firstly, the importance of time. Time and timing is of incredible importance when it comes to development. It is, in the first instance, a process that takes time. Development is a process in time. And we need to distinguish development from revolution or rapid societal transformation and evolution as slow societal transformation, slow, endogenously emerging transformation. Development is the alternative to those. What do we mean with a revolution? A revolution is potentially a very rapid transformation process, very rapid acquisition of power, change of the status quo that reaches a peak. And because it so often, not always, but when we're talking about political and socio-political revolutions, it very often involves a destructive aspect. And so something is broken down in the process in order to build the new. And in the context of our farms that we just spoke about, a revolutionary approach would, for instance, be to not only strike on a regular basis to bring that economy under pressure, but even to chase those farmers from those farms, and even to burn down their farms and their pack houses and so on. That's part of the revolutionary mindset. So the implication of that is that if you want to proceed, even if you have chased the farmers away, you want to now take over that means of production in Marxist terms. And if you've burned down the farm, if you've destroyed the infrastructure, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to proceed with the development trajectory. So revolution often looks like that. Evolution, on the other hand, could be a process that looks like that. In other words, a process in which there is no interference. The French concept laissez-faire, the system is left to its own devices, and the evolutionary dynamics in some way or another brings about change by itself. Obviously, this is a very long process, and in a society like South Africa and developing societies that suffer from acute inequality, we can't afford the luxury of that long drawn out process of change. Too much damage has been done in these societies, and that has accumulated to the point that the system is so unstable that if we don't have a sense of urgency and start doing something in a focused, planned, deliberate kind of way, the system will fall apart and everyone will suffer the consequences. So development is this pragmatic, planned, targeted a process that can be regarded in this sense of the word as a third option. It has got a sense of urgency. It's got a tempo that is quicker than evolution, but it is not as quick and potentially destructive as a revolution. So that's the first important message that we need to get out of this, and the implication of that is that everyone needs to understand that one, we can't leave things to itself, and two, we've got to be patient. Those particularly who suffer as a consequence of acute inequality, it's not going to be possible to bring about change in the rapid kind of way that revolutionary rhetoric wants us to believe. We have to commit to a process over time which is going to enable us to put the building blocks, to put the stages of development together in a sequential building up process. The other important implication of this graphic is that we are moving from a status quo of low quality of life to higher quality of life. The desired future is then associated with this higher quality of life. I use the term inclusive well-being. So inclusive well-being, quality of life, and what we need to say to one another is that where we are at any given point in time, we will never be able to predict the future. We cannot predict the future. We can only envision. We can only have an idea of a desirable future. But we need that. If we don't have a concept of a desirable future, it's very difficult for us to put together the plan, the approach, and have the commitment and the momentum to take us from the current undesirable situation to a desired or a better future. So we need to have a concept of what a better society looks like, a better world. And we don't need to present that in specific terms. We've got many tools in the social sciences that we can use in order to describe what we're talking about there. So, for instance, the United Nations Development Goals provides us with indicators. It gives us an idea of what it looks like when we achieve an optimal state of development. There's wonderful work that has been done in terms of developing and designing indicators of quality of life and of well-being. So in a particular community or societal context, we need to have a set of indicators that tells us this is what that desirable future looks like. This is what it looks like in terms of things like the state of health, the mortality, and the rate of in the community. This is what it looks like in terms of school completion. This is what it looks like in terms of employment, in terms of individual and household income, and we can have a set of indicators with an optimal level or a goal that ultimately need to be seen as what we strive for. And obviously then we use the same set of indicators to describe the undesirable status quo, the current situation. And if we can have a set of indicators like that start off with a baseline, a profile of our community or communities, um, identify where we are in terms of those indicators, and then start working out the process whereby we're going to move step by step by step from this point to the eventual desirable future. Then we have the basics of a development plan. Now it becomes a matter of strategizing, of planning, and of getting the different parties or stakeholders, as we tend to refer to them, the different sectors of society, for them to start working together in order to achieve this systemic, inclusive state of well-being. Another very important element that I need to point out, this this development trajectory is clearly not a straight line. Um, it's drawn deliberately to depict an undulating up and down, stop and start process. That's the reality. That's the reality of life. Life is like that. Nothing is just a smooth ride. That's the complexity of reality. And development is no different. If we're going to embark on a development process, however well we plan, and however well we take into consideration whatever potential obstacles or hindrances in our way, we are not in a position to predict the future and to control the path towards the future. We will encounter unexpected events and obstacles, and we will at some point or another even get to the point of, process coming to a standstill, even taking a few steps back. But as long as we have a sense, a mission, a vision of a desired future, and we have an understanding of this bigger process, then we also we have the patience, we have a sense that it's going to take time, then it will become possible for us to overcome the inevitable stop and start, faster, slower pace of development. So the second graph, we've got the first picture in our mind, and that serves as a template. The philosophers talk about a paradigm. It's a picture through which you look at the world. So we want to move away from a paradigm which is all about adversarial politics, oppositional politics, and protest politics. That's the paradigm that's not getting us anywhere. We want to move towards a paradigm which is a collaborative developmental paradigm. So we've got the picture of development, the paradigm of development in our mind. Next question is, how does change actually happen? How do we move from the one position to the next? So, same graphic. I'm not going to repeat. It's time there. It's low quality of life there. It's high quality of life there. It's undesirable status quo here. It's desirable future there. There's the path of development. But the important thing that we need to bring in now is that we always have a context. There is always a context, and there is always what is referred to as agency by social scientists, but we can just talk about action. We always have a context, and people, leaders, individuals, groups of people acting in that context. And our first objective as people that want to promote and champion a process of development is to analyze that situation. We need to first ask the question, what does this context look like? In other words, where is power concentrated? Where is wealth concentrated? How concentrated is it? And who has the means? And what are the means for bringing about change in this particular community? The question about who then refers to who are the so-called stakeholders, and what are their interests? What power do they have? What means do they have? How skilled are they? How capable are they? And how can we get them to do what needs to be done in order to take this process forward? So there's a contextual analysis that is required, that involves an analysis of the power relations, the socio-economic dynamics, a range of other things that needs to be understood. But very importantly, we need to understand who it is that are in this particular social system. What are their interests and what are they capable, and what are they interested in doing and what not? So the possibility for action in any context is constrained or enabled by the particular realities of the moment. So there's always constraints and there are always opportunities. If you don't understand those, you are not going to be able to be strategic. So you first need to understand this particular context that we are in now, given the outcome of the past and how it's brought about this particular situation, how it constrains who, in what kind of way, and what is possible and not. And if you understand that, and you have your idea of where you want to go to in the long run, it enables you to set some targets in terms of what you want to achieve as a first stage of development. Important thing is that if people have acted in that context, they transform that context to a new context. And as they have acted in that context, they also become transformed. So you have context 1, agency 1, context 2, agency 2. And so every time that you act in a particular context, you transform both context and the actors or agencies. And it produces a new context and agency. New context and agency. And the inevitable implication of what we are saying here is that a development process, a planned, pragmatic development process, is a staged process. It goes through stages, and we need to understand how these stages build up, stack up, how certain things can be done here, but in this particular context, it's not possible to do what comes later on, because there are certain things that happen before the next things can happen. That is development. Development, per definition, is a process of change in which there is an accumulation of capacities, of things that accumulate from the first to the next, to the next, to the next. And if you do not respect the sequential nature of that process, you're going to find that the actions that you want to take on prematurely, if you want to jump over that stage into that stage, and you haven't completed that one to a sufficient extent, you're going to find that that one is not sustainable. In other words, you start off, to illustrate this, you need to start off with people at least understanding the bigger picture, you understand, you have a mindset, and you appreciate the fact that certain kinds of skills are required. You want to now transform the economy of a certain community. You cannot start with a program for entrepreneurial, promoting entrepreneurs right at the start here and say, there we go, there's some ideas how to start businesses. Um, I'm sure you are keen to do that as members of this community. Let's start doing business. Those people are the victims of an education system that has not given them the necessary skills. They have not got the confidence and the other means to become entrepreneurs in the sense that we would want them to be entrepreneurs. So there is a developmental process that needs to happen here. So mindset first. Second, probably is a process of the acquisition of skills, of training in entrepreneurial skills, financial skills, management skills, a range of skills that makes it possible for that person to start becoming an effective business person. It may also require that we make some changes in the environment, in the context in which those people are going to do their business, so that it is more enabling. I mean, doing business in a township community under current conditions is hugely difficult because there's not an enabling environment. So people will fail, and you need to ask the question then: what is it that need to happen first before development can proceed towards the further levels of development? You cannot give someone a farm today, someone who's been working on a farm, and say, okay, now there you go, farmer, goodbye. There's the farm for you as a farm worker or farm workers. Take over and proceed. You can do that if you build in the developmental process. You've got to understand what are the kind of skills that are required here. What are not only the skills but the mindsets and the relationships and dynamics that are required for that person or people to become capable of taking over that farm. Build that into your process, yes, and at some point in the future they will have the potential to become farmers, successful farmers. But don't throw them into a situation and say, go ahead and do it, and they have not been prepared for it. That's a certain recipe for development failure. And let's be brutally honest about that. There's a lot of that happening in a country like South Africa, where people are being put into positions where they have a lot of power and must make important decisions, but they're not really adequately equipped in order to do that. They come from an environment and a background that have not equipped them to fulfill the requirements of being effective in that particular position or situation that they've been thrown into. And a developmental process would say, hey, give it a little bit more time. Let's work out the steps that we need to take in order to get to that point, so that that person can become more effective in achieving what needs to be achieved. So critical is stages. Development occurs in stages, and we need to understand the complex relationship between context and agency. Okay, so if we say that development is a staged, progressive, cumulative building up process from an undesirable present situation towards a desirable future, if you look at the way in which development and development processes have been approached in South Africa and in other countries, you will find that there's a certain language, a certain discourse, a certain set of words that are consistently being used to talk about development. So if you take that and you unpack your development process that I've just referred to and label your stages so that people understand what you're talking about, you come up with a development process that is defined by 4 generic stages. There could be many variations on this theme. This is just an approach that I can enable people to understand and that we can translate into action so that we stop talking about the concepts, the definitions, the theories, the ideologies. Let's just get something that makes sense and make it a reality in practice. So the 4th graph, in fact, I skipped one, which was the staged one, so I make it 3 graphs. So the 3rd graph is one in which there are 4 stages, and I'm only going to use acronyms in order to describe what I'm talking about. So the first one is to create enabling conditions. I've in the past referred to this as enabling reconstruction. So that's the first one. Create an enabling environment, create enabling conditions. Without that, there's no going forward. Or there's going forward, but with a very strong likelihood of failing and ending up in a vicious cycle that keeps on repeating itself. So that the next stage, and this is really where development happens, is the phase of systemic and institutional or sustainable systemic and institutional transformation. And then the next one is emergent differentiated growth, and the final one is inclusive well-being. 4 stages, this one being a preparation for that one. That is really the transformation process. That is what emerges from that, and that is the long-term goal that we want to achieve. Let's quickly have a look at what I mean with each of these. In the initial stage of creating an enabling environment or enabling conditions, very typically, like happened in many of the communities that I started working with, there's an initial stage of underlying or manifest conflict, tension and conflict amongst the different stakeholders of that particular community. This is the result of that acute inequality and the absence, the frustration that comes from being in a perpetual cycle of deprivation, of not being able to improve the quality of your life. Eventually, that frustration becomes aggression, and people start fighting with one another, and they fight with government, and they fight with farmers, and whoever becomes targeted in order to express that frustration. So it's in a certain sense it's inevitable. The instability and the inequality in that system conditions that type of action. However, If people are in conflict and in strife, we cannot proceed with development work. Because the first thing that we want to achieve, if we're talking about collaborative development, it means that people of different sectors of society, even if they were arch enemies in the past, they need to start working together in some way or another. So the first thing that you need to achieve in this process is what can be referred to as a cessation of hostilities. Make peace. Get a mediator, get a conflict manager, get someone that can help everyone to just calm down and to get everyone to agree that we will stop fighting with one another for a given period of time, 2-3 months. Give the process a chance so that we can see what can happen. So the first thing is get peace. And even if we acknowledge the fact that peace is fragile and that there are reasons why people want to fight with one another or why someone is an enemy, we acknowledge that. However, we need that moment, that window of peace in order to get this process of development going. So that's the first thing. The next thing is we need to identify real leaders, authentic leaders. We need them to step forward. And we need to distinguish between people that masquerade as leaders, people that present themselves as leaders, people that are false leaders, and real or genuine leaders. And the distinction is quite simple. The real leader is someone that are not unaware of and not completely not motivated by their own interest, but as a leader, they are inclined to serve the interests of others, their community, their constituency, those who they care for. That's a leader. A false leader is someone that uses a position of power, seeks positions of power in order to serve self-interest or the interests of their clique or their section of society in a self-interested, a selfish kind of way. So we need to make a distinction between those two, and we need to assist and promote the genuine leaders. We're not going to say to the other leaders that are self-interested or false leaders, if you want to use that term, goodbye. We are going to keep on engaging with them because we believe with this approach that there's a false consciousness, there's a misunderstanding of your real interests, that your actual interests are actually entangled with the interests of the common, of those in the bigger system. So self-centeredness ultimately becomes self-defeating, and it's a question of getting people to understand that. So we will not give up on anyone. There's no reason to give up on anyone. It's a question of getting the minds to shift towards seeing the bigger picture. So mindset change is the next very important thing, and this very video is part of that mindset change exercise. So once we have identified the leaders, ideally the leaders across the different sectors of society, the next piece of important work to do is to get those leaders to start thinking, reflecting on the difference between a confrontational, adversarial, destructive, conflict-orientated type of politics as against what we are talking about here, and that is working with other people, collaborating with other people, even if they are the enemy. And there's a wonderful book that is written by Adam Kahane, which is all about collaborating with the enemy. Why we have to work with one another. We can't get away from that. So shifting from the adversarial political, the protest politics to collaborative development. That's the mindset change that needs to happen, the first very important shift that needs to happen. And there's a number of more specific subcomponents of that mindset change that needs to happen. And when you get into that phase of the process, then you start looking at all those different aspects of the bigger paradigm shift or mindset shift that we are talking about. The next thing that we need to look at is that those leaders need to be skilled, because up to now, particularly leaders of communities that have suffered from marginalization and deprivation, and people that have become leaders in those communities have become skilled as political leaders who can mobilize people, who can stand up and present the ideas of a pre-defined or determined ideology to a group of people. So they can speak, they can present their case, and they are essentially good at rhetoric, but there's a whole range of leadership skills that they do not have. If we want them to be effective leaders, then training for development leadership is an absolutely critical part of this development process. People need to have the skills in order to draft a particular kind of document. They need to have the skills to make a particular kind of speech, to do some basic management and organizational actions that are required in order to create an organizational vehicle that could take the process of development forward. So there's a range of very basic skills that has to do with things like collaboration, partnership, teamwork, and so on. Even things like self-management and understanding yourself and plotting your own development path. Those are all things that's important in that leadership training process. So equipping leaders with a set of general mindset skills and a set of practical skills, writing, communication, organizational management type skills that are vitally important in order to turn them into from politicians into leaders that can lead a development process. Then you need some basic structures. You need a coordinating structure. You need some kind of organizational vehicle that could become the means whereby you pull leaders together and you start organizing training programs and you start communicating to their constituencies and the broader society about what you are busy doing. And that will involve communication strategies, and it will involve the formation of sub-teams and committees that people become members of, representing their different constituencies or sub-communities, but also focusing on certain thematic areas of work that are deemed to be part of this particular transformation process and what it wants to achieve. And finally, you need to have what is often referred to as low-hanging fruit. In other words, you need a set of actions, of projects, if you want, that can produce success relatively quickly, relatively inexpensively, and are guaranteed to a great extent that it will achieve success. Uh, that is extremely important because, in view of the time factor that we spoke about in terms of this process, this initial stage of creating the enabling conditions may take you a few months, let's say a year to 18 months for argument's sake. This process of institutional and systemic transformation can take you a few years. In fact, if you look at countries like China and many developed countries, and you look at what was done in terms of bringing about systemic and institutional development and transformation in those societies, in some instances 30, 40, 50 years. We don't need to take that long, but this is a long process. And that is before you really start seeing the results emerging from that. So this can take a long time. And thus we need to acknowledge the fact that while this big transformation process is taking place, people need to have an experience of success. They need to have a sense of concrete results, that it is possible to do this in a smaller time frame. So identify the things that you have in common, ideally things that impact on people across the spectrum in that community, the different sectors of the community, and get them to start working together. Take someone from the farming community and someone from the township community, for argument's sake, someone who's a known communist and someone who's a known capitalist, and someone who's an atheist and someone who's a minister of religion. Put them together in teams, deliberately putting those together that have in the past been at odds with one another. Facilitate a process of saying to them, there's a problem that you both have in common with one another. Let's start working together and let's see if we can make progress. One of the very interesting pieces of research that was done by social scientists who naively believe that we can get people to start working with one another, even get on and like one another, if we simply put them together. They found that in many instances they contributed to the stereotypes and ended up making people like one another even less. The solution to that problem was to get them into a situation where they realize the interdependence, which I referred to earlier, that they are presented with a problem where each one realized that if I want to achieve this objective, I need the other party, and the other party realized I need the other one. So, for instance, we want to go and watch a soccer match. The one's got the motor car and the other one's got the tickets. If I only have the motor car and I don't have the tickets, there's no entry to the grounds. And if I don't have the motor car, I can't get there. We need one another. So set up situations in which people work together and then realize that they are interdependent and see the magic happen. I've seen that over and over. So that's the first stage. The second stage, as I indicated, is the very difficult, long, hard slog of bringing about change in the way in which the different institutional systems of society operate and function. In a society like South Africa, from your most basic institutions, your family, your education system, your health system, your political system, your economy, all of these institutional systems operate in a way which is not what we want them to be. They are flawed by the conditioning of the past, and they keep on reproducing the undesirable status quo. So we need to recalibrate, we need to modify, we need to adjust in a very thoughtful way these different institutions. We need to look at what happens in an education system, what happens in that day-to-day functioning of a school system, so that we can make it produce different results that are counter to the undesirable present. How do we recalibrate it so that, and I'm not going to go into the detail, that's a very complicated long story, and it needs to be broken down in terms of the different institutional areas and spheres of society, each one requiring different ways of adjustment. But the important message is that we need to really apply our minds to make the systems and institutions of our society operate or function in a very different kind of way, in a sustainable fashion, not in an ad hoc once-off fashion. They need to be changed so that they become institutionalized. They need to function in a different way on an ongoing basis, thereby producing the outcomes that we want, the outcomes that are the counter to the status quo. So, emergent differentiated growth, a term that is used with quite a degree of caution, but the word emergent is very important. It emerges. Now we don't need to make artificial interventions. If we can change the institutions to start functioning differently, we don't need to make artificial interventions like affirmative action or BEE or targets or quotas. Our institutions are going to start producing different results by the way that they function. The outcome emerge from a changed way in which the institutions function on a day-to-day basis. Differentiated in such a way that those who have been excluded in the past are now brought into the system, so that they now are starting to benefit from the changed functioning of these institutional arrangements or systems. So there is an emergent differentiation, and growth starts happening in areas of society where in the past it has not happened. So it's growth where growth is needed, and not growth where it is already in excess. Because what we are talking about is a balancing out, a movement towards some form of equilibrium in a very imbalanced system. So it is a particular kind of growth. It's a systemic corrective kind of growth. And if that can proceed for a significant period of time, then we are moving towards the long-term goal, which we refer to as inclusive well-being. This word well-being, like quality of life, is chosen with some consideration. We are not merely talking about economic growth or growth in quantitative terms, in material terms, people getting more money or getting more wealthy. We're talking about growth in a qualitative and a quantitative sense of the word. Well-being refers to, yes, financial and material well-being, but it also refers to emotional and psychological well-being. It refers to well-being in a work environment, well-being in a physical and a mental and in an environmental. It's a holistic notion of well-being that we are trying to achieve if we are talking about a complex, integrated, multifaceted, holistic approach to development. That's the process, that's the mindset, that's the way that we want people to think. And if we can get this picture in our minds, then we can start looking at what it means in practice.